Hello, I'm 𝗪𝗵𝗲𝗏, founder of Starlit Contracts. A very warm welcome. We're here to help you negotiate and use contracts with confidence. And this video is part of our Build the Foundation in Contracts program. Our topic is termination. Let's look at this topic in summary now. And firstly, what is it? Well, termination is the ability of one of the contract parties to bring that contract to an end earlier than was otherwise planned. Now, this is different to suspension of a contract, because if you suspend the contract, the idea is that you can restart that contract once the reason for the suspension has been overcome. If you're terminating the contract, it means it's over. That's it. You cannot restart it. You might enter into a new contract, for example, but you cannot restart it. How does it work? Well, a contract can be terminated for a number of different reasons. It might be that a party reserves the right to terminate the contract for convenience, and it would typically be a customer who wants to maintain that right. Alternatively, a contract can be terminated for default. So by way of an example, it might be that the supplier has performed all of their work in accordance with the contract, but the customer has failed to make payment. In that situation, it would be the supplier who has the right to terminate the contract due to the default by the customer. The other way of looking at this is when the supplier has certain performance obligations in the contract. Perhaps they even received an advance payment from the customer, but that supplier has failed to begin the work. In this situation, it could be the customer that has the right to terminate the contract due to the default by that supplier. The final example is when there's an event of force majeure, and you can see our separate video on that topic. The idea of force majeure, though, is that there's some act of God or other event which is beyond the control of the parties, and that event impacts on the ability of the parties to perform the contract. In that situation, it could be that one or both of the parties have the ability to terminate the contract. Is this something that you should care about? Well, absolutely. You want to take into consideration in what circumstances should you have the right to terminate, and in what circumstances should the other party have that same right. And in all cases, if the contract is terminated, you should be considering, is there an amount of compensation that you would expect the other party to be paying to you? You might remember this practical example from our video on suspension, because of course, suspension and termination rights are very closely connected. If you've not seen that video on suspension yet, I recommend that you check it out. Goods Supplier Limited enters into a contract with Bad Payer Customer Limited. Several of customers' invoices are long overdue, and it is impacting badly on supplier's cash flow. Despite this, customer insists that supplier continue their work. What could go right for the supplier in this situation? Well, let's say that the supplier anticipated this risk very well, and they ensured that the contract entitles them to suspend the contract if there's a default by the customer, and also to terminate the contract if there's a default by the customer. So when the customer didn't make payment initially, on time, the supplier could have said to that customer, well, look, if you don't make payment within a certain time frame, then I've got that right to suspend due to your default. And it may be that the customer didn't make payment, and then the supplier did precisely that. They suspended. When the payment still was not forthcoming, the supplier could have said to the customer, well, look, we have a right to terminate due to your default. So if you don't make payment by a certain date, then we will do precisely that. And when the customer didn't make payment by that date, the supplier could have terminated the contract. Now, ideally, the contract would even have stated what compensatory payment would the customer be obliged to pay to the supplier if that supplier terminates due to the customer default. What can go wrong for the supplier in this situation? Well, let's say that they don't have a contractual right to suspend the contract or a contractual right to terminate the contract. That just means that the supplier is in a much more difficult position to try and recover payment. Potentially, they need to rely on the rights that may arise under the law that governs the contract. But this would necessitate, in many cases, that supplier needing to go to the courts to claim compensation and hoping that the law lands on their side. Let's look at a sample clause and some key considerations now, and firstly to the clause. Neither party may terminate for convenience. Now, instead of having that statement, you might just be silent in the contract on the ability for either party to terminate for convenience, and that would, generally speaking, have the same result. But keep in mind that if you need to comply with IFRS 15, then for a party to have the ability to terminate for convenience can impact on your ability to book that order, so be mindful of that and check with your accountant. Now, in all cases that I'm aware of, it's been the customer that's retained that right to terminate for convenience. I've not seen it on the supplier side. So let's look at that sample clause. Customer may terminate for convenience by providing supplier with, and then you insert a time frame, advance written notice. Customer will pay supplier promptly for all work performed in accordance with the agreement up to the date of termination and a compensatory payment of, and then you insert a sum or calculation for that compensatory payment. Keep in mind that the timing when the customer terminates that contract for convenience might impact on the amount of compensation that you expect from them. Let's look at another sample clause, but this time when a party might want to terminate due to a default by that other party. Customer, supplier, or either party may terminate immediately by providing written notice if the supplier, customer, or other party does not resolve the cause for suspension of the agreement within a certain time period of the date of suspension, or the customer, supplier, or either party is in severe financial distress. So the idea here is that you can expand on this list of items for when you can terminate for default according to your specific requirements in your contract. Let's continue with the sample clause now. When customer, supplier, or either party terminates for default, then customer will pay supplier promptly for all work performed in accordance with the agreement and a compensatory payment of, and then you would insert that sum, that value, or the calculation to establish how much should be paid. Now keep in mind that when there's a termination of the contract, the amount of compensation to be paid would often be different depending on whether the contract is terminated for convenience or due to a default by the customer or due to a default by the supplier. So you might want to identify different values that are to be paid depending on which scenario applies. I hope that this introductory content is helpful for you, but if you're ready to use a law firm or to hire a lawyer, then go to our website starlitcontracts.com, where we will help you to find the lawyer that you need to address your requirements. See you there.